Hey everybody, this is the first time I'm recording a video on my computer, so please let me know if the microphone is maybe a little bit too loud, too quiet, if there is too much background noise, or is it just about perfect. Now that this is out of the way, today we are looking at the bounce shot, and more precisely we're looking at the math behind the bounce shot. Now if we're looking at the math, there's two different categories that we're mainly looking at. First of all, we're looking at the crowd control effect, meaning how many hits are we getting in the assistance of bounce shot. And secondly, we are looking at the damage. And when we're looking at those two different categories, in both categories, I'm going to break down the math for tournament runs and I'm going to break down the math for farming runs. There is a subtle difference because in the farming runs, you have the perk targets option. So you'll get bigger amount of targets that you can get. Now, under both of those circumstances, we're also looking what happens or how much benefit are we getting if we add a module sub effect. And if we're adding a single sub, if we're having two subs, and which sub might be better under which circumstances and how do they complement each other. If we're doing that, next we're looking at how does it play out with different rarity of the module subs. And finally, we're gonna also add the option of what if we had the vault unlocked, because the vault has 3 additional percentage nodes that add to your bounce shot chance. I have hidden some parts of this Google Sheet just so that I can reveal you the information bit by bit while I'm giving explanations at the same time, because if I just showed you a massive Google Sheet all at once, then some places draw your attention, some places don't, and you don't know exactly where to look to find the information. So this way I think it's easier to comprehend the whole information of bounce shot. First thing we want to know when we're talking about the crowd control, it's super simple. If we don't have any bounce at all, how many hits are we getting in? And we're looking at how many hits are we getting in if we shoot 100 bullets. And it's pretty obvious, if we shoot 100 bullets, we're getting, with 0 bounce, we're getting 100 hits. Now we're not considering multi-shots right here. Now next, how much additional hits are we getting if we add the bounce shot chance from the workshop, and we're adding the bounce shot targets from the workshop. And what it does here, it shows you the total sum. So if we have maxed out bounce targets, we're hitting up to 9 enemies and 68% chance of hitting each one. So down here in this table, target 1 has 100% chance of getting hit, target 4 has 31% chance of getting hit, target 9 has 4% chance of getting hit. So hits per 100 bullets, this much, we're getting a total of 303 hits under these circumstances, which would be the tournament circumstances. Now if we're going to look at the same thing with farming runs, we're also getting 6 additional targets. Down here, you can see that I get 312 hits total, which shows that just under these circumstances, the targets perk, the bounce shot targets perk, is not a whole lot powerful, is it? But it may change under different circumstances as we look on. So what happens if we start adding module sub effects to this? I revealed the next part of the table. So first of all, if we add just a rare module sub chance under tournament circumstances, then we are getting 320 hits per 100 bullets. And if we do the same thing with farming, then with a perk targets bonus, we're getting 332 hits per 100 bullets that we're firing. If we go to a little bit higher, let's say that we're getting a target sub here, and this one is no sub. So we're having 1 sub, it's the targets. Under farming circumstances, 312, and non-farming circumstances, 0 here, 306. What does it mean? Well, it reveals the first realization here. If you want to have just 1 sub, then having epic targets is worse than having rare chance under these circumstances. Now, if we had instead the sub chance epic and this one 0, then in tournament circumstances 329, which is much better, and in farming we would have 343 hits per 100 bullets, which shows that the epic chance sub effect is much better than the epic target sub effect in both the tournaments and the farming. While in tournaments we get 329 hits instead of the 306 and 343 hits in farming instead of the 312. But what happens if we had both of the sub effects at the same time at the epic level? For farming we'll get 343, which is the same, and for non-farming, meaning the tournament, we are getting 334. This means that if you're using an epic module in your farming, then having two sub-effects is absolutely no better than having one chance sub-effect. And how does it make sense? Well, these additional targets that you're getting here with epic, that's one additional target. That one additional target is not the 10th target, but in case of farming, it's the 16th target, and it has only 0.59% chance of getting hit. So it adds 0.59 bullets per 100 bullets. That's why it makes sense. I will now skip to the point of the video where I will have the whole table filled out so I can compare the data with other rarity modules as well. There are a few important things I want to point out with this data. First of all, if you have just one module sub-effect, then if you're running a tournament and that sub-effect is targets, well, without any sub-effects you're getting 303 hits per 100 bullets. With the epic you're getting 306, legendary targets 308, 309 for mythic, and 310 for ancestral, which is almost no benefit compared to just regular workshop. But if instead of the target sub effect you would go with the chance sub effect, then the rare chance in case of tournaments is already better than legendary targets. Keep that in mind if you're having just one. And the same goes for farming. The rare chance sub effect for farming gives you 332 hits, while the ancestral targets one gives you 312. So the conclusion here is that if we're talking about crowd control and we don't have the vault unlocked, then if you want to have just one sub on your module, doesn't matter what is the rarity of your module, never take the target sub effect. But what happens if we're willing to have two subs? Would then targets be worth it? And let's look at this one. So if we're having epic chance versus both epic subs, there's just a very little benefit, but no benefit in case of farming. If we have legendary chance sub 349 hits versus both legendary subs in tournament 359, a minor benefit. In case of farming, almost no benefit at all. If we're looking at mythic, 393 in tournaments versus 416 in tournaments, maybe just a little bit benefit. But in case of ancestral, 433 from the sub effect of chance, and if we add the target sub effect, it's gotta be 473, which, depending on what your goal is, might be a reasonable pick for your sub. Now, if we're looking at farming, then even in the case of both ancestral sub effects, I personally don't see a whole lot of point in getting the targets in addition to the chance sub effect. The gain is very, very small here. And why is it so is because if we're putting the data here again, then going down, this is the 493. These last couple of targets, these 4 targets, would be these 4 targets, and there would be 3% chance of hitting this one, 2.8 for hitting this one, 2.2, 1.8. So it's just a couple of bullets. The chance gets very low of hitting those targets at that point. Now let's add Vault to the equation. Now if we didn't know, the Vault has 3 nodes, and each node in tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 gives you 4% additional bounce chance. And as we established before, if you didn't notice, then how does it work is that the higher your bounce chance, the more benefit you're gonna get out of additional targets. If your bounce chance was just 68%, then those additional targets didn't do almost anything. But if your bounce chance went up to 80% with the 12% module chance from the ancestral, then at least in the tournament case, we got some benefit from these additional targets. And if we're going to increase the percentage from the Vault, then let's look at the same scenarios. So first of all, if you didn't know that, you're going to need a minimum of 325 total keys to unlock the first bounce chance node, which is a lot of keys and comes pretty late in the game. And that's why I'm not going to take a whole lot of time at this point, but I'm giving you an overview. And we're looking at each one of the same scenarios, and what does it do is that all of these same scenarios will have 4% additional bounce chance with the first node. And here we get the results. What we can see here is that the same rules apply. The first rule is that if you're going to have one sub-effect, then under any scenario, the target sub-effect is better than the chance sub-effect. But the benefit of the target sub-effect is still a little bit better than it was in the previous scenario with no nodes. And it keeps getting better as we keep adding Vault upgrades to this. With the best case scenario, if you're going to have just one sub-effect and the first level of the Vault, then you're gonna have 495 hits per 100 bullets in tournaments, and in farming you're gonna have 579 hits per 100 bullets. But if you add the second sub-effect, you're gonna get 560 in tournaments, which is a pretty good increase, and in farming you're gonna get 602, which not that significant, then I would probably still consider a different module sub-effect. Now let's look quickly what happens if we had the second tier and the third tier from the Vault. Now if we are looking at the same data, in the case of having unlocked Vault Tier 2 and Vault Tier 3, the bounce shot chances, then the maximum possible bounce shot chance in the game is 92%, and the maximum amount of targets is 19. And in that case, we're getting 994 hits per 100 bullets. Now, obviously all of these hits are in the case of perfect circumstances where there is enough enemies to bounce the shots to. In actuality, sometimes the enemies might die, or sometimes there may be just one enemy and he's too far away from the other enemies for the bounces to bounce to. But we're looking at the perfect circumstances to get an idea of the math and how it scales. And in the case of Tier 2 and Tier 3 Vault unlocks, I am unaware of the additional keys number because I don't think there is yet a resource available online which shows the key costs for Tier 2 and Tier 3 nodes, even though I did some digging around. But if you want to look at this data, you can just put a video to pause. I'm going to do a quick summary of it. The bottom line is that no matter the circumstances, if you're having one module sub-effect, then the targets is never the better option. Secondly, targets can be useful if you have the chance sub and it starts shining more and more the higher your chance percentage is. For example, if you look at Tier 3 Vault, and in case of tournaments, upgrading that last 4 targets will give you from 660 hits to 827 hits, which is a very reasonable increase in crowd control. Now, all of this talk was about the crowd control effect of bounce shot, but when we're starting to talk about the damage, this may change totally, because if we're having the Astral Deliverance module, then the more bounces it gets, the higher the damage goes. And those later targets, 16, 17, 18, 19, etc., those ones will be the highest damage. Therefore, I would expect that the value of the target's mod sub effect will be much more valuable as compared to in terms of crowd control. But is it better still than the chance effect? We will look at that in a moment. Alright, let's look at the damage now. We have extended the table quite a bit. In case of damage, we're going to look at all of these same scenarios and each scenario separately with epic, legendary, mythic, or ancestral Astral Deliverance. Now, we're not going to look at the effect for 100 shots, but we're instead going to look the effect for one shot, how much damage we're doing per shot, if the tower base damage is 1. And down here you can see that I added the Astral Deliverance, where we trigger which rarity of Astral Deliverance we're having. What Astral Deliverance does, it increases the damage of every next bounce by this amount of percentage. And it works multiplicatively, not additively. And down here we have hidden the chances of getting hit and the hits per bullets, and we have added the damage. So for example, if we're having Astral Deliverance first, here you can see that we're doing this much damage if this number of enemy takes a hit. So 19th target will receive 26.6 times base damage, with the percentage that it has a chance of getting hit, obviously. Now, let me skip to the results. Alright, we're back and we filled out the first part of the table. Now, how it works is that in the column you can see the quality of the Astral Deliverance, and in the rows you can see the subs as we had it before. Now, for simplicity's sake, I only show the scenarios where you would have the best available subs for that quality of Astral Deliverance. Now, I know that under some circumstances, if you don't have enough reroll shards, for example, you might have a lower rarity sub for a specific module, but then the values would be anywhere in between, so I'm showing the best case scenarios for each option. So what we can see here, if you have 0 bounce at all, then Astral Deliverance doesn't do anything. So obviously you're just doing 1 damage per 1 shot if your damage is 1. But if you're adding just a basic workshop with 0 subs, you're already multiplying your damage by a good amount. With the ancestral Astral Deliverance, in case of farming, you're doing 88 times damage. This is effectively your damage multiplier for all your bullet damage. However, saying again that this requires that there's enough enemies to bounce to. But sometimes when you have just 2 enemies, the bullet will bounce back and forth anyway, the amount of times that the bounce chance triggers. So the case we established with the crowd control effect, that the target sub alone would be pretty much useless. Let's see if it holds ground here as well. In case of epic Astral Deliverance, if we do without any subs 4.6 damage, and with just the targets 4.7 and 5.2 relatively, it's not that big of an increase, but it's just a little bit. It's still much better than it was with crowd control. Looking at legendary module, 7.5 goes to 8.7, 10.9 goes to 11.8, 12.9 goes to 19.9, which is actually a pretty decent damage increase. 28.9 with farming goes to 40.5, and up here, in case of farming with the ancestral Astral Deliverance and having the ancestral target sub, you would get 200x damage compared to 80x damage with no subs. However, under each case, if you had the chance sub instead, it would be better. In case of farming, the difference is bigger, so here is more than 2 times difference, here is more than 2 times difference, here is a reasonable difference, here is just a little bit difference. But in case of tournaments, looking at this 4.7 versus 5.2, comparing the target sub and the chance sub, 8.7 versus 9.8 in case of legendaries, 19.9 versus 23.9, and 57.3 versus 58.2. It's not that big of a difference. So in case you're having just one sub on your ancestral astral deliverance, and you want it only for tournament purposes, in this case, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference whether you have the target sub or the chance sub. However, having them both is so much more powerful, as you see here. And in case of having farming astral deliverance damage, which probably doesn't matter for most of the players watching this video, because not a whole lot of players are doing bullet-based damage glass cannon build. But for the sake of calculations and understanding the game, I think it's a really good, really valuable research. And going back to, let's say that you have epic astral deliverance and you do want to do some damage in your farming runs for some reason, then having both epics doesn't give much benefit compared to having just one epic if it is the chance one. The difference is a little bit bigger in case of legendaries, but it's also very small, and it starts increasing once we get to the mythic one. So if you have a legendary or an epic astral deliverance and your purpose is doing damage with it, then having one sub is probably enough. You can maybe get more bang for your buck if you choose a different kind of sub overall. But let's see what happens if we start adding vault nodes to the same equation. Alright, welcome back. I filled out the table and I added the data for the cases if you add the vault tier 1, tier 2 and tier 3 unlocked. And there's several interesting discoveries I made. But first of all, I'm gonna mention that by the time you have unlocked the vault in the game, you most likely don't have any epic, legendary or mythic modules anyway. So these first three columns here, when it comes to vault, are kind of irrelevant. But I wanna just show something that I discovered along with that. But first, let's look at the final data. The number that is the most interesting, or everybody wants to know, is how big can you get the damage. And if you add all the vault keys, then you can get your damage multiplier from shooting basically up to 22,000. And this does not include multi-shot, this does not include the critical chances, which is pretty interesting. So every tier of the vault basically doubles your potential maximum damage output from 2,300 to 5,000 to 10,000 to 22,000 in case of both ancestral subs on your device. Now, another interesting discovery that I found is that when previously, no matter the case, it seemed that if you have one sub, then it always makes sense to have the chance sub. But once you start getting into the vault, in first tier of the vault, you can see that in case of the ancestrals, it makes more sense to get the target sub. Once you start getting vault tier 2, already with mythic, the same phenomenon shows out, and when tier 3, even with legendaries, and it's amplified once we start getting to the ancestrals. And that is only with the case of tournaments. And why is that the case? Is because once you start getting to the higher number of targets with damage, the damage multiplication is so high that having that additional target with a little bit smaller chance of hitting is gonna bring more total damage, because your chance of hitting them is already high enough. For example, without the vault is lower, then this doesn't show out. But once you start getting into the vault tiers 1 and 2 and 3, then chance of hitting goes up drastically, even for the last enemies. And in that case, just adding more enemies to hit with much higher multiplier is gonna bring out higher overall damage. And obviously I do have to mention that these calculations are under the perfect situation, under the perfect conditions. None of these take into account that bounce shot actually has a range, so if the enemies are farther away from each other, the bullets are not gonna bounce. But all you need, in most cases, is just 2 enemies, because if you have the light speed shots, then the bounces will happen instantly back and forth between those 2 enemies, and if they have enough health, then you are capable of doing this amount of damage average per shot, or this is the damage multiplier. The recording of this video took way more effort and time than I expected that it would. So if you appreciate the effort, and if you think you found something useful out of this video, or you at least found it entertaining, please leave a like down below. Leave a comment if you have any additional questions, or you think I made a mistake somewhere, and please subscribe for the algorithm. Thank you. See you next time. You're just doing 1 damage per 1 shot if your damage is 1. But if you're adding just a basic workshop with 0 subs, you're already multiplying your damage by a good amount. With the ancestral astral deliverance, in case